Looks like it's like a trash bag.
Tonight, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos giving an update on the search for Nancy Guthrie nearly 6 weeks since her disappearance.
Do you think that this suspect could strike again, whoever did this?
Well, absolutely. We believe we know why he did this, and we believe that it was targeted, but we're not 100% sure of that. And so it'd be silly to tell people, yeah, don't worry about it. You're not his target. Don't think for a minute that because it happened to the Guthrie family, you're safe. No, keep your wits about you.
We pressed Nanos about that potential motive.
In early 2026, investigators in Tucson, Arizona, stood before cameras discussing a case that had quietly grown into one of the most perplexing abduction investigations in the United States. The victim was Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old resident of the Catalina foothills and the mother of national television journalist Savannah Guthrie. Authorities described the scene at Guthrie's home as concerning, with physical evidence suggesting she had been taken during the night. Surveillance cameras, forensic traces, ransom communications, and a rapidly expanding FBI task force would all become part of the investigation. But the case did not unfold in a straight line. Early assumptions proved unreliable. Digital evidence raised new questions. Surveillance footage contradicted witness timelines. As investigators retraced the final hours before Nancy Guthrie vanished, small details that initially seemed insignificant began to carry greater weight, reshaping the timeline and exposing how a carefully executed crime could hide in plain sight. Every case starts with evidence and works toward the truth. We rely on verified facts, documented timelines, and official records, not speculation or sensationalism. Subscribe to stay updated as we examine each case clearly, carefully, and professionally. By the 6th week of the investigation, authorities had reached a critical conclusion about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Investigators publicly confirmed that the incident was being treated as a suspected abduction rather than a voluntary disappearance. The decision was based on forensic evidence collected from her residence in the Catalina foothills area outside Tucson and on surveillance footage recovered during the early stages of the investigation. The case quickly expanded beyond the resources of local law enforcement. Detectives from the Pima County Sheriff's Department formally requested assistance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Federal agents joined the investigative task force, providing additional forensic specialists, digital analysts, and behavioral experts. Search operations began across neighborhoods surrounding the victim's home, while investigators processed electronic evidence recovered from the property and nearby surveillance systems. Authorities confirmed that evidence inside and outside the residence indicated that Nancy Guthrie had likely been removed from the home against her will during the overnight hours. Her disappearance was first noticed when she failed to appear for a scheduled church live-streamed the next morning. When relatives visited the house to check on her, they discovered that she was missing and immediately contacted emergency services. At the same time, investigators focused their attention on a masked individual captured near the property. The figure appeared briefly in surveillance footage recorded by the home's doorbell camera system. The individual's presence raised immediate questions about whether the person had been scouting the property or actively participating in the abduction. In addition to surveillance footage, investigators began reviewing digital communications believed to be ransom messages. Several messages demanded payment in cryptocurrency, though none led to verified negotiations or confirmed contact with the victim. Authorities did not confirm whether the messages were authentic or attempts to exploit the publicity surrounding the case. Despite the extensive investigative effort, which involved hundreds of law enforcement personnel and generated thousands of public tips, no suspect had been publicly identified. The investigation remained active, and officials stated that they believed the crime was targeted rather than random. As investigators worked backward from the conclusion that Nancy Guthrie had likely been abducted, several pieces of physical and digital evidence became central to the case. One of the most significant discoveries occurred during the forensic processing of the property. Investigators located blood traces near the front entrance of the residence. Laboratory testing later confirmed that the DNA from the blood belonged to Nancy Guthrie. This finding had immediate investigative consequences. Prior to the discovery, authorities were still considering several possible explanations for the disappearance, including the possibility that she had left the house voluntarily. Once the blood evidence was confirmed, The investigation shifted toward the likelihood that a violent encounter had occurred at the residence. Detectives did not publicly disclose the quantity of blood recovered or whether it indicated a serious injury. However, officials confirmed that the presence of blood was inconsistent with a voluntary departure. Another key development involved footage recovered from the home's video doorbell camera. The recording showed a masked individual approaching a residence during the time frame when investigators believe the abduction occurred. The individual appeared to be wearing gloves and carrying a backpack. Investigators also reported that the person attempted to interfere with the camera system, suggesting that the suspect was aware of the surveillance device and deliberately tried to disable it. Although the footage was brief and partially obscured, authorities released images of the individual to the public in hopes of identifying the person. Law enforcement described the suspect as a male of average height and build. The backpack visible in the footage was identified as a specific hiking model, which investigators hoped might help generate tips from the public. During the review of electronic evidence, investigators also identified unusual digital activity in the area surrounding the residence. Several neighborhood internet systems experienced temporary outages or disruptions during the period when the abduction is believed to have occurred. While technical malfunctions can occur for many reasons, investigators examined the possibility that a signal jamming device or other electronic interference had been used. Such equipment can disrupt wireless networks and disable certain security cameras. If confirmed, this would suggest that the perpetrator had planned the operation in advance, taking steps to reduce the likelihood of being recorded. At roughly the same time, authorities received multiple communications demanding payment in cryptocurrency. These messages claimed to provide information about Nancy Guthrie's whereabouts. Investigators treated the messages cautiously. Law enforcement agencies frequently encounter ransom demands in high-profile cases that originate from individuals who are not connected to crime. Digital forensic teams examine the messages for metadata, routing information, and other identifying markers. Officials did not publicly confirm whether any of the communications were linked to the suspect's seen in surveillance footage. The turning point in the investigation occurred when forensic teams began analyzing how the various pieces of evidence fit together. Initially, the clues appeared unrelated. The surveillance footage showed an unidentified person near the property. The blood evidence indicated a potential struggle near the front entrance. Digital network disruptions suggested technical interference. When investigators placed these details on a timeline, a clearer pattern emerged. The masked individual seen in surveillance footage appeared during the same time frame when the neighborhood's internet systems experienced temporary disruptions. The interruption of digital signals would have limited the effectiveness of nearby security cameras and alarm systems. Shortly afterward, the blood evidence indicated that an incident had occurred near the entrance of the home. Investigators concluded that this sequence of events was consistent with a scenario in which the suspect approached the residence, interfered with security systems, and then forcibly removed the victim. This analysis led investigators to conclude that Nancy Guthrie had most likely been abducted during the night rather than leaving voluntarily. The finding represented a major shift in the investigation. Once authorities determined that the crime was likely a targeted abduction, the investigative strategy changed significantly. Detectives began focusing on several new lines of inquiry. First, they examined whether the suspect may have planned the crime in advance by studying the victim's routines. Nancy Guthrie lived alone and followed a consistent schedule involving church activities and regular contact with family members. Second, investigators explored the possibility that more than one individual participated in crime. Disabling security systems, approaching a residence, and removing the victim could potentially require multiple participants. Third, detectives investigated whether the suspect had any prior connection to the victim or her family. Because Nancy Guthrie was a mother of the nationally known journalist Savannah Guthrie, investigators considered whether the case might involve someone who had targeted the family because of their public profile. At the same time, law enforcement agencies expanded search operations across the surrounding region. Search and rescue teams deployed drones, police dog, and aerial surveillance in an attempt to locate any trace of the victim. Despite these efforts, no confirmed sightings or recoveries were reported. Authorities continued to analyze physical evidence recovered from the home, including potential DNA samples, gloves, and other materials discovered during searches of nearby areas. Forensic laboratories began processing these items in hopes of identifying a match in national criminal databases. Meanwhile, the investigative team continued to receive thousands of tips from the public. Each lead was reviewed and documented, even if it ultimately proved unrelated to the case. By this stage of the investigation, the central conclusion remained unchanged. Investigators believed that Nancy Guthrie had been forcibly removed from her home during the overnight hours, and that the individual responsible had taken deliberate steps to avoid detection. The identity of the suspect remained unknown, and the investigation continued as authorities worked to determine who carried out the abduction and why. In the first days following the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, investigators from the Pima County Sheriff's Department were faced with a situation that did not immediately point to a single clear explanation. When deputies first arrived at the residence in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson, they had limited information about what had occurred overnight. Because the case began as a missing person report, investigators initially examined several possible explanations before concluding that the circumstances were more serious. The early phase of the investigation was defined by a process of elimination. Detectives worked through multiple theories that could potentially explain why an elderly woman had disappeared from her home during the night. As the investigation progressed and forensic evidence was collected, each of these theories was eventually ruled out. The first possibility investigators considered was that Nancy Guthrie might have left her residence voluntarily. This is a standard assumption in many missing person investigations, especially during the earliest hours when there is no confirmed evidence of violence. Detectives initially examined whether she may have stepped outside briefly or left the property for personal reasons. However, the interior condition of the residence quickly raised doubts about that possibility. Investigators noted that several of her most essential items were still inside the house, including her mobile phone and personal belongings. These items are typically taken by individuals who leave their homes voluntarily, particularly when a departure is expected to last more than a few minutes. Another critical factor was her medication. According to family members and investigators, Nancy Guthrie relied on daily medication and had mobility limitations that made independent travel difficult. Officials later stated she could not walk long distances without assistance. Because her phone, medication, and other daily necessities remained inside the home, the voluntary departure theory became increasingly unlikely. Within a short period of time, investigators determined there was no credible evidence that she had chosen to leave the residence on her own. The second theory investigators examined involved the possibility of a medical incident. Given that Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old, detectives considered whether she might have suffered a medical emergency that caused confusion, disorientation, or an attempt to leave the house during the night. In many cases involving elderly individuals, sudden health issues such as fainting, dizziness, or cognitive episodes can lead to situations where a person wanders away from home. Investigators searched the immediate area around the property for signs that she might have collapsed nearby or attempted to walk away before becoming disoriented. Search teams reviewed nearby desert terrain, residential streets, and surrounding properties to determine whether she might have left the house and become incapacitated outside. However, several factors contradicted the medical emergency theory. First, the physical evidence around the entrance of the house suggested a disturbance rather than a simple exit. Second, her limited mobility meant that traveling far from the home without assistance would have been extremely difficult. Because of these factors, detectives concluded that a medical incident was unlikely to explain the situation. The growing evidence suggested that another person had been present at the residence during the critical hours of the night. A third theory explored by investigators involved the possibility of a random crime. Detectives examined whether the incident could have been a result of a burglary that escalated unexpectedly. This type of scenario sometimes occurs when intruders enter a home with the intention of stealing property, but encounter a resident, leading to an unplanned confrontation. Investigators check for signs of forced entry, missing valuables, or indications that the home had been searched by an intruder. However, the interior of the residence did not show evidence consistent with a burglary. Most of the victim's personal belongings remained in place. There were no clear indications that someone had moved through the house looking for items of value. Because there were no signs of theft, investigators began considering another possibility, that the person responsible may have specifically targeted Nancy Guthrie. Authorities later indicated that they believed the crime was not random, though the potential motive has not been publicly disclosed. By the end of the first phase of the investigation, detectives had eliminated the three most common explanations: voluntary departure, medical emergency, and random burglary. The evidence was pointing toward a more deliberate event. As investigators began processing the property more thoroughly, the residence itself became the most important source of evidence. Deputies who entered the home observed several details that immediately raised concern. Inside the house, personal belongings appeared largely undisturbed. Items were left where they would normally be, suggesting that Nancy Guthrie had not prepared to go anywhere before the disappearance. However, the entrance area told a different story. Investigators identified signs of disturbance near the doorway. These included irregularities around the front entrance and physical evidence outside the house. One of the most significant discoveries was a small amount of blood located near the entrance of the residence. Forensic analysis later confirmed that the blood belonged to Nancy Guthrie. The presence of blood suggested that an injury had occurred during the time frame of the disappearance. Although authorities did not publicly describe the severity of the injury, the findings significantly changed the direction of the investigation. Once blood evidence was confirmed, investigators began treating the location as a potential violent crime scene rather than a standard missing person situation. The residence was secured while forensic specialists collected evidence from both the interior and exterior areas of the property. Crime scene technicians examined the entrance area, surrounding surfaces, and nearby walkways to determine how the events may have unfolded. Because the circumstances indicated a possible abduction, homicide detectives were assigned to assist with the investigation. The decision to involve homicide investigators did not necessarily mean that a death had occurred. Instead, it reflected the seriousness of the evidence discovered at the scene. Officials later described the conditions inside the residence as very concerning, emphasizing that the physical evidence was inconsistent with a voluntary disappearance. At this stage, investigators began reconstructing the timeline of Nancy Guthrie's final confirmed movements. To understand how the disappearance occurred, detectives focused on establishing a precise timeline for the evening before Nancy Guthrie was reported missing. The timeline begins on January 31st, 2026. That evening, Nancy Guthrie spent time with members of her family before returning home. At approximately 9:50 p.m., she was dropped off at her residence by her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni. According to investigators, he was the last known person to see her alive that night. After arriving home, there were no confirmed reports of anyone seeing or speaking with her again. Investigators believe that sometime during the overnight hours between late January 31st and early February 1st, an unknown individual approached the property. Evidence later recovered from a doorbell security camera showed a masked individual near the entrance of the home during the time frame in which the disappearance is believed to have occurred. In the footage released by investigators, the individual appears wearing gloves and carrying a backpack while interacting with the doorbell camera mounted near the front door. At one point, the person attempts to obstruct the camera lens using nearby plants. The timing of the footage corresponds closely with the estimated period during which Nancy Guthrie is believed to have been taken from the residence. However, the video does not capture the actual moment of the abduction. Instead, it shows activity near the entrance shortly before the camera system stopped recording. The next confirmed event in the timeline occurred the following morning. On February 1st, Nancy Guthrie was expected to participate in a scheduled church livestream. When she failed to appear, members of her church community became concerned and contacted the family to ask about her absence. Family members then went to her residence later that morning to check on her. When they arrived, they searched the home and surrounding property, but could not locate her. After confirming that she was missing, the family contacted emergency services. Around midday, the disappearance was officially reported to the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Deputies were dispatched to the residence shortly afterward, initiating what will become a large-scale investigation involving local authorities and federal agencies. From that moment forward, the case transitioned from a missing person inquiry to an investigation into a suspected abduction. Despite extensive searches, forensic analysis, and public appeals for information, Nancy Guthrie's whereabouts remain unknown. The events that unfolded between the moment she was dropped off at her home and the discovery of the blood evidence at the entrance remain the central mystery investigators continue trying to solve. Nancy Guthrie was an 84-year-old resident of the Catalina foothills area near Tucson. She had lived in the region for more than 5 decades after moving there with her family in the early 1970s. Over the years, she became known in her local community as a longtime church attendee and a resident who maintained a stable routine. Guthrie was also widely recognized as the mother of television journalist Savannah Guthrie. Despite her daughter's national media profile, Nancy Guthrie maintained a largely private life in Arizona. She lived alone in her home and managed her daily activities independently. According to investigators, she was mentally sharp and capable of managing her personal affairs. However, at age 84, she had limited mobility and depended on daily medication for an ongoing medical condition. These factors became critical in the investigation. Authorities noted that someone in her condition would have difficulty traveling far without assistance or preparation. When deputies responded to the residence after she was reported missing, they discovered that her phone, medication, and other personal belongings remained inside the house. Because of her reliance on those items and her physical limitations, investigators quickly concluded that a voluntary departure was highly unlikely. From the beginning of the case, law enforcement classified her as a vulnerable adult. This classification significantly influenced the urgency of the investigation. It also reinforced a belief among investigators that Nancy Guthrie did not leave the residence willingly and that outside involvement was likely. In the early days of the investigation, detectives focused primarily on locating Nancy Guthrie and securing the immediate crime scene. As the inquiry expanded, several small details that initially appeared unrelated began to gain importance. One of the first overlooked indicators involved reports of internet disruptions in the neighborhood on the night of the disappearance. At the time, these outages were treated as routine service interruptions. Later, investigators began analyzing the timing of those disruptions. The outages occurred during the same window in which Nancy Guthrie is believed to have been taken from her home. This raised the possibility that a device may have been used to interfere with wireless signals or disable connected security equipment in the area. While investigators have not publicly confirmed that signal interference occurred, the timing of the disruptions has remained part of the forensic review. Another complication involved surveillance coverage around the property. Multiple cameras were installed on and around the home, but the critical time period of the suspected abduction was not clearly captured on available footage. Investigators later determined that certain cameras stopped recording or failed to capture activity during a precise window when the incident likely occurred. These gaps made it more difficult to reconstruct a minute-by-minute timeline of events. As the FBI and local authorities reviewed older footage from property, they identified several unidentified individuals who had appeared near the home in previous recordings. Although none of these individuals were linked directly to the disappearance, the presence of unfamiliar people near the property raised the possibility that the home may have been observed or monitored before the incident occurred. These details prompted investigators to consider whether the crime had been carefully planned. Despite weeks of investigative work involving local law enforcement and federal agencies, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie still contains several unanswered questions. One major point of focus is the identity of the masked individual captured on surveillance footage near the home around the time the incident occurred. Authorities have confirmed that the individual appeared to tamper with a doorbell camera while carrying a backpack, but the person has not been publicly identified. Another unresolved issue is the motive. Investigators have stated that they believe Nancy Guthrie was specifically targeted rather than randomly selected. However, officials have declined to disclose the suspected motive while the investigation remains active. Additional questions remain under review. Whether ransom messages connected to the case were sent by the actual perpetrator, whether the internet disruptions were deliberate sabotage or unrelated technical issues, whether the individual seen on surveillance footage acted alone or with assistance. Investigators continue to analyze forensic evidence, surveillance data, and digital records. For now, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remains an active case with several critical pieces of the puzzle still unresolved. Facts verified. Case concluded. Justice is determined by what can be proven. Subscribe for more documented cases and real criminal investigations.